66 million years ago, on an ordinary spring morning in the late Cretaceous period, a rock the size of a city was crossing the last few hours of its journey through space. It was roughly 10 kilometers wide. It was traveling at around 20 kilometers per second, and in approximately 4 hours, it would strike the shallow coastal waters of what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact released energy equivalent to roughly 100 million nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. Billions of tons of rock and sulfur were vaporized and thrown into the upper atmosphere within minutes. Wildfires spread across continents. Tsunamis hundreds of meters tall moved outward from the impact site in every direction. And then, over the days and weeks that followed, the debris settled into a shroud around the entire planet, blocking the sun. Global temperatures dropped by nearly 30 degrees Celsius. The plants died first, then the animals that ate the plants, then the animals that ate those animals. Within a geological instant, 3/4 of all species on Earth were gone, including every dinosaur larger than a house cat. That is what actually happened. That is the history written into a thin layer of iridium-rich clay found in rock formations across the world, right at the boundary between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras. But there is something most people do not fully appreciate about that event. It was not inevitable. Researchers have calculated that if the Chicxulub impactor had arrived just a few minutes earlier or later in its orbit, it would have struck deep ocean rather than shallow coastal waters. Less vaporized rock, far less sulfur thrown into the stratosphere, a regional catastrophe rather than a global extinction. The dinosaurs would have survived the impact entirely. Some scientists estimate the window of arrival that produced the extinction we know was no wider than 30 minutes. Out of the entire 365-day orbit, the asteroid completed around the Sun each year. 30 minutes. Out of that narrow margin, an entire lineage of animals was erased. And another, the mammals, was given its chance to inherit the planet. Tonight, we are going to follow the path that 30 minutes almost took away. We are going to ask what would have happened if the asteroid had arrived slightly earlier, struck deep water, and the dust had settled within months rather than years. We are going to ask what the dinosaurs would have become if they had been given another 66 million years to evolve. And we are going to walk through every step of that alternative history together, from the warm forests of the Cretaceous all the way to the world that exists today in a timeline that never happened. Take a slow breath. Let the weight of the present world fade back a little. This is a long story, and we have the whole night to tell it. The asteroid crosses into the upper atmosphere at a slightly different point in its orbit. The angle is shallower. The trajectory carries it not toward the shallow platform of carbonate rock and evaporite deposits along the Yucatan coastline, but out over the open Pacific toward water that drops to depths of several kilometers. The fireball is still visible from thousands of kilometers away. A white streak cuts across the early morning sky, moving faster than any sound can follow, gone before the eye fully registers it. The ocean receives the impact a few seconds later. The energy released is enormous. A column of superheated steam rises into the stratosphere. Tsunamis radiate outward in concentric rings, reaching coastlines across the Pacific Basin within hours and causing widespread destruction along every shore they touch. For the animals living near those coasts, it is catastrophic. For the planet as a whole, it is survivable. The key difference lies in the rock. In the timeline that actually happened, the Chicxulub impactor struck a region of seafloor and shallow continental shelf that was saturated with anhydrite and gypsum, both calcium sulfate minerals. When those rocks were instantly vaporized, they released an estimated 325 billion tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. That sulfur converted into sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere, forming a reflective haze that lingered for years and blocked enough sunlight to collapse photosynthesis across the entire planet. It was not the heat of the impact that killed 3/4 of all life on Earth. It was the sulfur. It was the darkness that followed. The open Pacific has no such mineral deposits. The impact vaporizes seawater, basaltic ocean crust, and a thin layer of marine sediment. Sulfur enters the atmosphere in far smaller quantities. The stratospheric aerosol layer forms, but it is thinner, and it dissipates within months rather than years. Sunlight returns. The planet cools briefly, perhaps by a degree or two in the most affected regions, but the global photosynthetic system remains intact. Plants keep growing. The food chains built on them remain unbroken. In the late Cretaceous, across what will one day become the northern interior of North America, the morning after the impact passes like most mornings. The air is warm and thick with moisture, carrying the smell of fern and conifer resin and wet soil. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are roughly 4 times higher than they are today, and the greenhouse effect keeps the planet uniformly warm from equator to poles. There are no ice caps. Sea levels stand perhaps 170 meters higher than the modern ocean. North America is divided into 2 land masses by a warm, shallow seaway running from the Gulf of Mexico north to the Arctic Ocean. The landscape on the western shore of that seaway, in what geologists will eventually call the Hell Creek Formation, is a broad coastal floodplain covered in dense subtropical forest, crisscrossed by slow rivers and layered with the kind of biological abundance that accumulates over hundreds of millions of years of uninterrupted evolution. A herd of triceratops moves through the undergrowth at the forest edge. Each animal weighs somewhere between 6 and 9 metric tons. Their skulls alone account for roughly 1/3 of their total body length, and from the tip of the longest horn to the trailing edge of the frill, a full-grown adult spans nearly 9 meters. They move with a low, continuous sound, produced not by vocalization but simply by the displacement of so much mass through vegetation, branches yielding slowly under pressure, soil compressing in wide depressions underfoot. The frill of each animal is flushed with color, pigmented skin stretched over a lattice of bone, and in the early morning light filtering through the canopy, the herd moves as a slow mosaic of earthy tones and deep reds between the trees. What makes this moment significant is not the size of these animals. It is their number. Paleontologist Jack Horner once estimated that Triceratops fossils account for roughly 56% of all large dinosaur remains recovered from the Hell Creek Formation. That is a staggering proportion. It suggests that in the landscape of the latest Cretaceous, herds of Triceratops were not merely a feature of the ecosystem, but something closer to its defining characteristic. The large-bodied herbivore niche was not shared equally among many species. It was dominated, comprehensively and consistently, by one animal, the ecological parallel to the American bison before European contact, except armored with bone, crowned with horns, and far older as a lineage than any mammal alive at the time. Further north and east, along the riverbanks, a different kind of movement is beginning. A group of Edmontosaurus, the large hadrosaurs that share the floodplain with the ceratopsians, feeds on low vegetation at the water's edge. Their dental batteries, each containing several hundred interlocking teeth, stacked in precise columns and continuously replaced from below, work through coarse plant matter with an efficiency no other animal in this ecosystem can match. The mechanism functions something like a biological file, the teeth of each column grinding against each other as the jaw moves, producing a surface capable of processing the toughest leaves, bark, and fibrous stems. It is one of the most sophisticated chewing systems ever evolved by any vertebrate, refined over tens of millions of years of coevolution with the plants it processes. The air above the floodplain belongs to the pterosaurs, not the enormous Quetzalcoatlus, which favors open terrain farther from the forest, but smaller species with wingspans of 2 to 3 meters, riding the thermals rising off the sun-warmed mud of the riverbanks. Their bones are hollow, connected directly to a respiratory system that circulates air in one continuous direction rather than the back-and-forth tidal breathing of mammals. The entire skeleton of a medium-sized pterosaur weighs less than many of the individual teeth in the skull of a large tyrannosaur. They move through the air with almost no visible effort, banking on adjustments too small and too fast to follow. Somewhere in the forest interior, a Tyrannosaurus rex is sleeping. It has been active since before dawn, and its body temperature has stabilized at something close to the ambient warmth of the surrounding air. Its eyes, set forward in a skull built for binocular vision, are closed. Its breath moves slowly and deeply. Vision researcher Kent Stevens calculated that T. rex possessed visual acuity exceeding that of modern hawks, with the ability to detect movement at distances of up to 6 kilometers. In the filtered green light of the Cretaceous forest, those eyes are still now. The animal rests the way large predators rest everywhere and in every era, with the calm of something that has nothing nearby to fear. None of these animals know what happened in the sky the night before. None of them registered the distant flash over the Pacific. The asteroid passed, the ocean swallowed the impact, and the world continued exactly as it had continued for the previous 165 million years. The Mesozoic does not end this morning. It simply keeps going, and that changes everything. The forests of the late Cretaceous are not the ancient, static places they are sometimes imagined to be. They are in the middle of a transformation that has been building for tens of millions of years. Beneath the tall conifers and the spreading tree ferns, a quieter revolution is already underway, one that will reshape every ecosystem on Earth far more thoroughly than any single impact event ever could. It is carried not in fire or sulfur, but in petals and seeds, and the slow chemistry of roots pressing into soil. The Angiosperms, the flowering plants, first appeared in the fossil record approximately 130 million years ago, during the early Cretaceous. They were modest at first, low-growing pioneers occupying disturbed ground and riverbanks where the established conifers had not yet closed their canopy. But they carried within their biology a set of advantages that would prove decisive over long stretches of time. They reproduced faster than gymnosperms. Their seeds were enclosed in protective structures, insulated from drought and cold in ways that naked conifer seeds were not. And they had already begun forming relationships with insects, offering nectar in exchange for the transfer of pollen, an arrangement that allowed them to reproduce with a precision and efficiency that wind-pollinated plants could never fully match. By the time the asteroid misses in this alternative timeline, angiosperms have already become the dominant plant group in low-lying tropical and subtropical habitats across much of the world. What has not yet happened, and what will happen over the 10 to 15 million years that follow, is their complete conquest of the planet. Without the catastrophic disruption of the extinction event, without the abrupt collapse and clearing of existing plant communities, this conquest proceeds differently than it did in the actual Cenozoic. It is slower, more gradual, more entangled with the animals that depend on the older plant communities. But it is no less thorough for being slow. The most consequential development during this period is the proliferation of fruit. Fruit is one of the more intricate evolutionary strategies life has produced. A plant that invests energy in building a fleshy, nutritious structure around its seeds is making a calculated biological wager. It is betting that an animal will eat that structure, travel some distance, and deposit the seeds somewhere new, ideally with a pile of organic material to help them germinate. The return on that investment depends entirely on whether animals actually do what the plant needs them to do. And the late Cretaceous and early alternative Paleocene provide an enormous population of animals that are well positioned to fulfill exactly that role. A key detail that rarely receives much attention is how fruit changes the character of a forest from the inside out. Fruit-bearing trees are not simply adding a food source. They are rewriting the terms of every relationship in the ecosystem. Animals that can exploit fruit gain access to concentrated calories at predictable locations. They begin to modify their behavior accordingly, shifting their ranges to follow fruiting seasons, developing preferences for particular tree species, becoming more sedentary in areas of high fruit density. This clustering of animal activity around fruit sources accelerates the dispersal of seeds into new areas, which in turn expands the range of fruit-bearing trees, which attracts more animals. The feedback loop is self-reinforcing, and once it reaches a critical scale, it restructures the entire forest community around it. In the forests of the alternative early Paleocene, roughly 60 to 55 million years ago, this process is accelerating across the tropical regions of every continent. The canopy is thickening with angiosperms. The understory is filling with their seedlings, and the animals living in and around these forests are beginning to respond. Among the dinosaurs, the lineages best positioned to benefit are the smaller maniraptoran theropods. This group, which includes the dromaeosaurids, troodontids, oviraptorosaurs, and the ancestors of modern birds, had already been evolving towards smaller body sizes and more varied diets for tens of millions of years. Many of them possessed grasping hands capable of manipulating objects. Several had evolved forward-facing eyes that provided the binocular depth perception useful for judging distance when reaching into dense vegetation. Some had already lost their teeth entirely, replacing them with lightweight keratinous beaks that required no calcium investment to maintain and could process a wide range of food items. The oviraptorosaurs are a particularly instructive case. By the late Cretaceous, this group had already diversified into dozens of species across Asia and North America, ranging from turkey-sized animals to creatures approaching the dimensions of a large horse. Most of them were toothless. Their beaks varied considerably in shape, some narrow and pointed, others deep and strongly curved, suggesting a diversity of diets that paleontologists are still working to fully characterize. What is clear is that this group was already experimenting with hard object feeding, processing seeds, tubers, and possibly hard-shelled invertebrates. As fruit becomes more abundant in the forests of the alternative early Paleocene, the oviraptorosaurs are among the first large-bodied vertebrates capable of exploiting it systematically. Smaller maniraptorans follow a different path into the canopy. The troodontids and dromaeosaurids, lighter and more agile than the oviraptorosaurs, begin spending more time in the branches of the expanding Angiosperm forests. Their grasping feet, already adapted for seizing prey on the ground, prove equally useful for gripping branches. Their relatively large eyes, well adapted to detecting movement in low light, serve them in the filtered illumination of the forest interior. Over millions of years, some lineages within these groups shift their diets gradually toward fruit and small arboreal prey, their bodies lightening, their feet becoming more dexterous, their beaks slowly reshaping to handle the soft, sugar-rich flesh of tropical fruits. There is something else happening beneath the trees that is easy to overlook but ecologically profound. The leaf litter of an angiosperm-dominated forest decomposes differently from that of a conifer forest. Angiosperm leaves are broader, thinner, and generally lower in resins and lignins than conifer needles. They break down faster when they fall, releasing their nutrients back into the soil more quickly. The soil beneath an angiosperm canopy becomes richer, more biologically active, more densely threaded with fungal networks and invertebrate communities. This richer soil supports a denser and more varied understory, which in turn supports a denser and more varied animal community at every level. The Cretaceous-age soil ecosystems that develop under the expanding angiosperm canopy are supporting populations of insects, worms, millipedes, and small vertebrates that have no equivalent in the older conifer forests. These communities become the foundation of an entirely new set of food webs, feeding the small maniraptorans, hunting in the leaf litter, feeding the early mammals still confined to the nocturnal margins, feeding the countless invertebrate species that themselves become food for larger predators. The forest floor is becoming more alive, more layered, more complex than it has ever been. By 55 million years ago, in the alternative timeline, the world is a different place from the one the late Cretaceous dinosaurs inherited. The broad outlines are familiar. The continents are still in approximately the same positions. The climate is still warm, though a long cooling has begun that will eventually reshape everything. But the vegetation has shifted fundamentally. The pole-to-pole conifer forests that define the Mesozoic are giving way to something more varied, more colorful, more seasonally structured. The smell of the air is different, sweeter in the lowland tropics, where fruit ripens in overlapping cycles throughout the year. The sounds are different too, the canopy filling with the calls of animals that have learned to exploit the new abundance. The dinosaurs have not yet changed dramatically in form, but their diets are shifting. Their ranges are expanding and contracting in response to new vegetation patterns. And within the populations of the smaller maniraptorans, the quiet pressure of natural selection is already beginning to favor individuals with slightly more dexterous hands, slightly more flexible feeding behaviors, slightly larger brains relative to their body size. The forest is asking new questions of the animals living in it, and some of those animals are beginning, in the only way evolution ever allows, to answer. Around 56 million years ago, something unusual happens to the planet's climate. Within a span of roughly 20,000 years, a geological blink, global temperatures spike by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The mechanism involves a massive pulse of carbon released into the atmosphere, likely from volcanic activity associated with the opening of the North Atlantic and the destabilization of methane hydrates on the ocean floor. Palm trees push north into latitudes that will one day be occupied by boreal forests. Crocodilians bask on shores that will eventually freeze under Arctic ice. The deep ocean warms significantly, disrupting circulation patterns that have been stable for millions of years. Scientists in the actual timeline will call this the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, and they will find its chemical signature written clearly in the oxygen isotope ratios of deep-sea sediment cores. In the alternative timeline, this event still occurs. Its causes have nothing to do with the presence or absence of the asteroid, and its effects on the dinosaur world are profound, though not in the direction one might initially expect. The already warm climate of the alternative early Paleocene pushes several degrees warmer still. The equatorial lowlands become hotter and more seasonally arid than any dinosaur ecosystem has experienced since the early Mesozoic. In response, many of the larger ground-dwelling dinosaurs shift their ranges poleward, following the retreating band of comfortable temperatures. But the canopy of the tropical forest does something different. It thickens. The higher temperatures and elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide accelerate the growth of trees. The Angiosperm canopy closes more tightly above the forest floor. The understory dims. The air at ground level becomes hotter and still, while 20 and 30 meters above, in the canopy, a breeze moves through broad leaves and the light is full and rich and constant. It is precisely in this period of maximum warmth that the smaller maniraptoran theropods begin moving upward in earnest. The transition does not happen rapidly. Nothing in evolution happens rapidly when viewed from the outside. What happens is that over hundreds of thousands of years, individuals within several troodontid and dromaeosaurid lineages that spend slightly more time foraging in the branches survive and reproduce at slightly higher rates than those that remain on the ground. The ground at the height of the thermal maximum is a more difficult place to find food. The canopy, dense with fruit and insects and small vertebrates, is not. The selection pressure is gentle but persistent, and persistence over geological time accomplishes what no single dramatic event could. The anatomical changes that accumulate are not the ones that might be expected from a primate-centric view of arboreal evolution. The maniraptorans do not develop grasping hands in the manner of a monkey. Their hands retain 3 functional fingers tipped with claws, but the angles at which those fingers can move begin to shift. The inner finger becomes capable of opposing the outer 2 to a degree that allows a firm grip on a branch of moderate diameter. The wrist joint becomes more flexible, allowing a wider range of motion that is useful when reaching into dense foliage for concealed fruit. These changes are subtle at the level of any single generation. Across 2 million years, they are transformative. The foot undergoes its own modification. The second toe of many maniraptoran theropods, the one equipped with the enlarged claw made famous in the popular imagination, begins in some lineages to shift in function. Rather than being held elevated and used as a prey-capturing weapon, it begins to press downward and inward against branches, functioning as a partial grip. The foot of a Cretaceous dromaeosaurid was already capable of exerting powerful downward force. What changes in the Eocene descendants of these animals is the range of directions in which that force can be applied. There is something worth dwelling on about the sensory biology of these animals. In the actual Cenozoic, primates evolved trichromatic color vision, the ability to distinguish red from green, as an adaptation that helped them identify ripe fruit against a background of green foliage. Ripe fruit is typically redder or yellower than unripe fruit, and the ability to detect this difference is a significant foraging advantage in a fruit-rich forest. What paleontological evidence suggests about dinosaur vision is more impressive still. Analysis of the genes involved in color vision, inferred through the study of living birds and reptiles, which share common ancestors with non-avian dinosaurs, indicates that the ancestral dinosaur likely possessed 4 types of color-sensing cone cells in the eye, rather than the 3 found in most primates. This is tetrachromatic vision. It extends into the near ultraviolet range, allowing the detection of patterns and color contrasts that are entirely invisible to human eyes. Many flowering plants reflect ultraviolet light from their petals and fruit surfaces in patterns that serve as signals to pollinators and seed dispersers. An animal capable of perceiving these ultraviolet signals does not need to wait for fruit to turn visibly red. It can detect ripeness at distances and in lighting conditions where a primate would see only uniform green. The arboreal maniraptorans of the alternative Eocene are navigating their forest with a sensory apparatus that exceeds anything a primate lineage will ever produce. Their world is richer in color and pattern than the one perceived by any mammalian eye. The feathers of these animals serve multiple functions simultaneously. In the cooler temperatures of the pre-thermal maximum world, the dense body plumage provided insulation. As temperatures rise, the same feathers can be flattened against the body or partially spread to manage heat. In the canopy, where visibility is variable and predators approach from multiple angles, the coloration of the feathers provides camouflage against the dappled light. But feathers are also display structures, and the animals using them are social. The plumage of the arboreal maniraptorans in this period is varied and elaborate, reflecting the diversity of social and reproductive signals that complex group living demands. Crests, throat patches, and tail fans in colors beyond the visible spectrum communicate information between individuals that observers equipped only with human senses would be entirely unable to read. The social structure of these canopy communities is itself a driver of neural expansion. Living in groups requires keeping track of individual identities, of social hierarchies, of who owes what to whom, and who can be trusted. The cognitive demands of group life in a three-dimensional environment, where threat can approach from above as well as below and lateral, where the location of every fruit tree in a home range must be held in memory against the backdrop of seasonal change, are substantially higher than the cognitive demands of solitary ground-level predation. The brains of the most social canopy-dwelling maniraptorans in this period are measurably larger relative to body size than those of their ground-dwelling relatives. Not dramatically larger, not yet, but the trajectory is established. And in evolutionary terms, a trajectory is everything. By 40 million years ago in the alternative timeline, the tropical forests of every continent harbor populations of small feathered theropods that spend the majority of their lives above the ground. They are still recognizably dinosaurian. The long balancing tail, the three-fingered hands, the forward-facing eyes set in a lightly built skull, the feathers covering every surface from crown to toe. But they move through the canopy with an ease and precision that no animal of their body plan has ever achieved before. They know their forest the way it can only be known from the inside, tree by tree, season by season, individual by individual. The canopy is theirs now, in the same quiet, comprehensive way that the ground has always belonged to their larger relatives below. While the smaller theropods are ascending into the forest canopy, the sky above that canopy remains the domain of a lineage that has held it for over 150 million years. The pterosaurs, flying reptiles that first appeared in the late Triassic period, had been sharing the air with the ancestors of modern birds for the entire span of the Cretaceous. They were not dinosaurs in the strict taxonomic sense, but they were closely related, part of the broader archosaur lineage, and they had evolved powered flight independently and earlier than any bird. By the latest Cretaceous, they had already produced the largest flying animals the planet had ever seen. And in the alternative timeline, that trajectory does not end. The most important thing to understand about the giant age-darchid pterosaurs of the late Cretaceous is that they were not what their size might suggest. A wingspan of 10 or 11 meters is the scale of a small aircraft. An animal operating at that scale might be expected to be slow, ungainly, dependent on constant wind or confined to cliff-top launch sites. But the evidence from fossil trackways and skeletal mechanics suggests something very different. The age-darchids were not coastal cliff dwellers or ocean skimmers. Their trackways show they walked on flat ground, on all four limbs, with a gait more reminiscent of a large terrestrial animal than a seabird. Their long necks and toothless beaks, combined with their apparent preference for inland environments, suggest a hunting strategy closer to that of a modern stork or marabou crane than an albatross. They stalked across open floodplains and the margins of shallow lakes, seizing prey from the surface, with a beak sometimes longer than an adult human arm. Launching a body the size of Quetzalcoatlus into the air from flat ground is a biomechanical problem that took decades of research to resolve. The answer involves the quadrupedal launch mechanism used by all pterosaurs, regardless of size. Unlike birds, which launch primarily with the explosive extension of powerful hind limbs, pterosaurs used their forelimbs as the primary engine of takeoff. The wing membrane attached along the length of the arm, and the elongated fourth finger, and the entire forelimb acted as a vaulting pole, driving the animal upward with a single explosive push from all four limbs simultaneously. In a large age-darchid, the forelimb muscles driving this launch were among the most powerful in any flying animal ever to exist, anchored to a massive keeled sternum and a shoulder girdle built for the transmission of enormous force. From a standing start, Quetzalcoatlus could have been airborne within a single stride. Once in the air, the physics of flight at this scale become favorable in ways that are counterintuitive. Very large pterosaurs were almost certainly dedicated soarers, relying not on the continuous flapping that smaller pterosaurs used, but on the energy contained in columns of rising air. Thermals, generated when sunlight heats the ground unevenly, rise in spiraling columns that can carry a soaring animal upward at several meters per second with no muscular effort required. Modern wandering albatrosses, with wingspans of up to 3.5 meters, use a technique called dynamic soaring to cross entire ocean basins by continuously harvesting energy from the wind gradient near the water surface, traveling thousands of kilometers with almost no wing flapping at all. The giant age-darchids, with wingspans 3 times wider and wing proportions designed for thermal soaring, could ride a single strong thermal from ground level to an altitude of several kilometers, then glide across distances of hundreds of kilometers before encountering the next rising column of air. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum is precisely the kind of climate that the largest soarers find most congenial. Stronger differential heating of the ground means more intense thermal columns. Higher overall temperatures mean the columns rise higher and carry more energy. The PETM effectively widens the aerodynamic envelope within which giant soaring animals can operate, making it possible to travel farther between thermals, to soar at higher altitudes where the air is thinner and drag is reduced, and to remain aloft for longer periods without returning to the ground. In the alternative timeline, the age-darchid lineage responds to the PETM by doing what successful lineages always do when their environment becomes more favorable. It diversifies. Some lineages remain tied to inland habitats, their long-necked terrestrial stalking strategy continuing to work well across the warm floodplains and lake margins of the alternative Eocene. Others begin spending more time over the open ocean. The productive tropical seas of the PETM, warmer and richer in marine life than at almost any point in the previous 50 million years, offer a foraging ground that rewards size and range. An animal that can soar indefinitely does not need to expend energy flying to a feeding site. It simply follows the thermals until it finds fish near the surface, descends in a long glide, plucks its prey from the water, and rises again on the next available column of air. The pycnofibers covering the pterosaur body, those hair-like filamentous structures preserved in exceptional fossil specimens and almost certainly providing insulation and aerodynamic streamlining, confirm that pterosaurs were endothermic. They maintained their body temperature through metabolic heat generation. This is significant for flight at extreme altitude. The air at 4 or 5 kilometers above sea level is cold and thin regardless of surface temperatures. An animal insulated by a dense coat of pycnofibers loses heat far more slowly and can maintain the metabolic rate needed for active flight control even when the surrounding air approaches freezing. The largest soarers in the alternative Eocene carry this coat of fine filaments over every surface, except the wing membranes themselves, pale and reflective on the underside, darker above, a countershading pattern that mirrors the coloration found in many modern oceanic birds. There is an ecological dimension to the dominance of large pterosaurs that is easy to overlook. An animal capable of traveling several hundred kilometers in a single soaring session is not confined to a single ecosystem. It connects ecosystems. Seeds caught in its digestive system are deposited hundreds of kilometers from where they were consumed. Parasites and pathogens carried on its body move between populations that would otherwise remain completely isolated from each other. In a world where the major landmasses are still broadly connected, and where no ecological barriers prevent pterosaur movement between continents, the largest soarers function as living threads, stitching the biological communities of the planet together. The forests of North America and the forests of Asia, separated by thousands of kilometers of overland distance, are linked by the regular passage of animals moving between them on thermal highways that follow the warmth of the sun. By 40 million years ago, the sky of the alternative Eocene is occupied at multiple levels simultaneously. At the highest altitudes, where the air is cold and clear and the horizon carries the faintest suggestion of curvature, the giant soarers trace long ellipses on columns of air rising from the warm earth far below. Lower down, smaller pterosaur species and the increasingly diverse birds that share the sky with them fill the middle altitudes with motion. The boundary between land and sky in this world is not a sharp edge. It is a gradient, a layered transition from the roots of the forest through the canopy to the thermals rising from the warm earth, occupied at every level by animals that have had 66 million uninterrupted years to learn exactly where they belong. Around 34 million years ago, something fundamental shifts in the architecture of the planet's climate system. The change does not announce itself. There is no single event, no sudden threshold crossed. It accumulates slowly, driven by the movement of continents that has been underway since before the first dinosaur ever walked the Earth. But its consequences are as profound as any asteroid impact, and they will not be undone for millions of years. The trigger is a narrow channel of water opening in the Southern Ocean. For tens of millions of years, Antarctica had clung to a thin connection with the southern tip of South America. That connection, a submerged ridge of continental crust, had been sufficient to deflect the flow of ocean currents northward, preventing the formation of a continuous circumpolar current around the Antarctic continent. Warm water from the tropics could still reach Antarctic shores, keeping the continent relatively mild despite its polar position. But as the tectonic plates continue their slow migration, as South America drifts northward, and the gap between the two continents widens from meters to kilometers to hundreds of kilometers, that deflection fails. A cold current begins to circulate around Antarctica, unimpeded for the first time in hundreds of millions of years. It is known in the actual geological record as the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and its establishment marks one of the most consequential oceanographic events in the history of the Cenozoic era. The circumpolar current is a barrier made of water rather than rock. It insulates Antarctica from the warmth of the tropics as effectively as any mountain range could. Within a few million years of its establishment, ice begins to accumulate on the Antarctic continent for the first time since the Carboniferous period, more than 250 million years earlier. Sea levels fall as vast quantities of water are locked into continental ice sheets. The global ocean circulation patterns that had been redistributing heat from equator to poles shift into new configurations. The PETM warmth is a fading memory. The long cooling has truly begun. But the Drake Passage, as this southern channel will one day be called, is only one driver among several. In the north, a different geological process has been working on the planet's atmosphere for far longer. India's collision with Asia, a collision that began around 50 million years ago and will not reach its full expression for tens of millions more, has been pushing up the Himalayan mountain range and the Tibetan plateau with relentless slowness. The importance of this uplift for global climate lies not in the mountains themselves, but in the chemistry of their erosion. Fresh rock exposed by uplift reacts with rainwater and atmospheric carbon dioxide in a process called silicate weathering, producing bicarbonate ions that are eventually carried by rivers to the ocean and deposited as carbonate sediments on the seafloor. Each ton of fresh mountain rock that weathers draws a proportional quantity of carbon dioxide permanently from the atmosphere. The Himalayas are, in effect, a geological carbon sink operating on a planetary scale. Over tens of millions of years, the weathering of these mountains has been drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations with the slow inevitability of compound interest. The greenhouse effect weakens. The planet cools. The pole-to-pole forest that defined the Mesozoic and persisted through the warm Eocene begins to feel the pressure of a changed atmospheric chemistry. In the alternative timeline, these geological processes unfold exactly as they did in the actual Cenozoic. No choice made by any animal can alter the movement of tectonic plates or the chemistry of mountain erosion. The dinosaurs, whatever they have become after 40 million years of evolution, are subject to the same planetary forces that shape the world of their ancestors. The forests that have sheltered and fed their lineages for nearly 200 million years begin, slowly and then with gathering momentum, to retreat. The retreat does not happen uniformly. Tropical regions near the equator, where rainfall remains high and temperatures remain above the threshold that trees require, hold their forest cover longest. It is at the margins, in the higher latitudes and the continental interiors where rainfall has always been more seasonal, that the change first becomes visible. Trees require a minimum of moisture and warmth to germinate, grow, and reproduce. As the climate cools and the interior of continents becomes drier through the redirection of moisture by newly raised mountain barriers, those minimums are no longer reliably met across the vast interior plains that had once been covered in continuous forest. What replaces the trees in these marginal zones is not initially grass. It is open ground, sparse shrubland, the beginnings of a landscape type that has no precedent in the experience of any dinosaur lineage. The first patches of genuinely open terrain appear as scattered clearings in thinning woodland, places where the trees have died and their seedlings cannot establish fast enough to replace them. These clearings are small at first, measured in hectares rather than kilometers, but they have a physical property that accelerates their own expansion. A forest creates its own microclimate. The canopy intercepts rainfall and releases it slowly into the soil. The roots of trees draw water upward from depth and release it through their leaves into the air, maintaining local humidity that benefits the forest itself. When a forest patch shrinks below a critical size, this self-sustaining microclimate collapses. The soil dries more rapidly. The air above it becomes drier. The seedlings at the clearing's edge fail to establish. The clearing grows. In ecology, this process is sometimes described as a tipping point, a threshold beyond which the system cannot return to its previous state, even if the external conditions that caused the initial shrinkage are temporarily reversed. In the continental interiors of the alternative Oligocene, roughly 30 to 25 million years ago, Forest patches are crossing these tipping points one by one. Each collapse adds to the area of open ground, and the expanding open areas create conditions that make neighboring forest patches more vulnerable in turn. The retreat, once it reaches a sufficient scale, becomes self-sustaining. For the large ground-dwelling dinosaurs, this transformation presents something entirely without precedent in their evolutionary history. A ceratopsian or hadrosaur, standing at the edge of a receding tree line and looking out across several kilometers of open ground, is encountering an environment that no ancestor of its lineage has ever experienced. The forest had offered shade, cover from aerial predators, ambush opportunities for the carnivores, and concealment for the prey. It had structured the world into compartments small enough that a large animal's presence could be hidden. The open ground offers none of this. It is continuous and undivided, stretching to a horizon that seems impossibly distant after a lifetime spent among trees. The sensory experience is different in ways that are difficult to overstate. Sound carries farther without trees to absorb and scatter it. A ceratopsian that calls to its herd members on open ground can be heard from distances 3 or 4 times greater than in a forest. The smell of a distant predator, no longer filtered and dispersed by vegetation, arrives as a clear and directional signal. The sky is fully visible for the first time, not as fragments glimpsed through gaps in the canopy, but as an unbroken dome from horizon to horizon. Quetzalcoatlus lineage pterosaurs, soaring overhead, are no longer partially hidden by foliage. They are fully visible, identifiable, at great distances, part of a new visual landscape that the dinosaurs on the ground are only beginning to learn to read. The animals that survive in this new environment are not necessarily the largest or the fastest. They are the most observant, the most responsive to distant signals, the most capable of coordinating movement with others of their kind across distances that forest life had never demanded. The open landscape is selecting for new capacities, and the dinosaurs, as they have done through every transformation the planet has imposed on them over nearly 200 million years, are beginning to respond. The grass itself arrives gradually. Its first significant expansion across the continental interiors begins around 23 million years ago in the alternative Miocene epoch, driven by the same declining atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations that have been cooling and drying the planet since the Oligocene. Grass does not conquer open terrain because it is particularly well adapted to any single condition. It conquers it because it has evolved a set of biological properties that make it extraordinarily difficult to kill through the methods that work on almost every other plant. The key lies in a photosynthetic innovation that most plants never developed. The majority of terrestrial plant species use a biochemical pathway called C3 photosynthesis, named for the 3-carbon molecule that is the first stable product of carbon fixation. C3 photosynthesis works well under the high carbon dioxide concentrations that characterized most of Earth's history, but it becomes less efficient as carbon dioxide levels drop. Many grasses, particularly those that dominate in warm, seasonal, semi-arid environments, have evolved an alternative pathway called C4 photosynthesis, which concentrates carbon dioxide around the enzymes responsible for fixation before the fixation step occurs. This concentration mechanism allows C4 plants to photosynthesize more efficiently than C3 plants under low carbon dioxide conditions, and to do so with less water loss per unit of carbon fixed. As atmospheric carbon dioxide has been declining through the Oligocene and into the Miocene, this advantage becomes increasingly pronounced. The C4 grasses are not simply surviving in the open terrain that the forests have abandoned. They are actively outcompeting every other plant that tries to colonize those spaces. The second property of grass that makes it so difficult to eliminate is simpler but equally consequential. Grass grows from its base rather than its tips. When an animal bites through a blade of grass, it removes the upper portion but leaves the meristematic tissue, the actively dividing cells from which growth originates, intact at the base of the plant. The grass regrows from below within days. When fire sweeps across a grassland, which it does regularly in warm, dry, seasonal climates, because grass produces large quantities of dry, flammable material. The above-ground portions burn, but the roots survive, and the grass regrows from its base within weeks. This growth architecture makes grassland effectively impervious to the two most powerful forces of destruction that any ground-level plant community faces: herbivory and fire. Remove the top, and the plant simply grows back. But grass exacts a cost from the animals that eat it. Embedded within the tissues of most grass species are microscopic particles of amorphous silica, a mineral that is, in chemical terms, a form of glass. These particles, called phytoliths, serve the plant as structural support and possibly as a deterrent against herbivory. For an animal chewing grass, they function exactly as glass particles would. They are extraordinarily abrasive, grinding against the enamel surfaces of teeth with every chewing stroke, wearing them down at rates that would rapidly reduce a flat-crowned browsing tooth to a smooth, functionless stub. An animal with the shearing dental equipment of a forest browser cannot sustain a grass diet for long before its teeth become too worn to process food effectively. In the actual Cenozoic, this problem drove one of the most important adaptive radiations in mammalian evolutionary history. The ancestors of horses, cattle, sheep, antelope, and dozens of other grazing lineages independently evolved hypsodont dentition, teeth with very tall crowns that extend far below the gum line and are exposed progressively as the outer surfaces wear away. A hypsodont tooth functions like a continuously dispensed pencil, always presenting fresh grinding surface, regardless of how rapidly the exposed portion erodes. In combination with other adaptations, such as complex folded enamel patterns that maintain cutting ridges even as the crown wears, hypsodont dentition makes sustained grass feeding biologically feasible. In the alternative timeline, the ceratopsians face exactly this problem as the Miocene grasslands spread across the continents they inhabit. Their ancestral dental equipment is a shearing battery, not a grinding one. The interlocking teeth of the ceratopsian jaw were designed to slice through tough plant material, the way scissors cut fabric, each tooth working against the one above or below it to produce a clean cut. This system works well for processing the leaves and stems of browsing vegetation, but produces rapid and uneven wear on grass. The ceratopsian lineages that begin to exploit grassland resources are almost immediately subject to intense selection pressure, favoring any variation that reduces the rate of dental attrition. The solution, arrived at over millions of years across multiple lineages, is not identical to the hypsodont solution evolved by the mammals. The developmental pathways available to a lineage of ceratopsians are not the same as those available to a horse ancestor. What the ceratopsians evolve instead draws on the capacity for continuous tooth replacement that is a fundamental feature of reptilian biology. Unlike mammals, which replace their teeth only once from the deciduous to the permanent set, reptiles can replace individual teeth throughout their lives. Crocodilians replace each tooth dozens of times over a lifetime. The ancestral condition for archosaurs, the group that includes all dinosaurs and pterosaurs, almost certainly involved continuous replacement. The hadrosaurs had taken this one step further, evolving dental batteries where hundreds of teeth were present simultaneously and constantly being replaced from below, producing an effectively continuous grinding surface. The ceratopsians, starting from a different configuration, evolved their own version of this solution. The crowns become taller. The replacement rate accelerates. The enamel develops a more complex folded structure that maintains functional ridges for longer before they are worn smooth. On the alternative Miocene plains, a mature ceratopsian of a grassland lineage is a very different animal from the forest-dwelling Triceratops of the late Cretaceous. Its beak is broader and more squared off, designed to crop grass in wide horizontal sweeps rather than to grip and tear browsing vegetation. The frill, once an elaborate display structure whose coloration communicated social status and reproductive condition, has reduced in area and thickened in cross-section, its vascularization simpler, its shape less ornate. The energy that previous lineages invested in the biochemical machinery of frill pigmentation and the structural complexity of elaborate bony projections has been redirected toward the jaw musculature and the digestive system. The gut of a grassland ceratopsian is longer, with more extensive fermentation chambers than that of its browsing ancestors, because the tough cellulose and silica-laden tissues of grass require more processing time to extract comparable nutrition. These animals move in herds. The transition from forest life to open terrain life has made herd formation not a behavioral option, but a survival imperative, and the specific dynamics of that imperative have been studied with precision in the actual Cenozoic herbivores that the ceratopsians now parallel. An analysis first formalized by biologist W.D. Hamilton in the 1970s demonstrates that herd formation is not primarily altruistic behavior. Each individual animal that joins a group statistically reduces its own probability of being selected as a predator's target, because the predator's attention is diluted across a larger number of potential victims. The safest position in any herd is the geometric center, and individuals compete continuously to occupy central positions, which is what produces the close clustering and the constant low-level jostling visible in large herbivore groups across every open landscape on Earth. Beyond this dilution effect, the herd functions as a collective sensory system of considerable sophistication. A single animal can monitor a limited arc of its surroundings at any given moment. A herd of several hundred animals, with eyes positioned on the sides of their heads, each scanning a different portion of the surrounding terrain, provides nearly continuous surveillance of a full 360-degree perimeter. When any individual in the herd detects a potential threat and responds, the response itself becomes a signal. A slight stiffening of posture, a shift in orientation, a brief cessation of feeding in a nearby animal propagates through the herd as a wave of heightened attention, focusing the collective sensory system on the relevant direction within seconds. The herd does not need a leader to coordinate this response. It operates as a self-organizing early warning network, each animal simultaneously a sensor and an amplifier. The information about danger moving faster than any individual assessment could manage. The grassland ceratopsians of the alternative Miocene are learning, through the slow instruction of natural selection, what the wildebeest and the zebra and the Cape buffalo learned in the actual Cenozoic. The open plain demands community, and community, in return, offers something that no individual capacity can match. The predators face a different version of the same problem. The open grassland that removes concealment from the herbivores removes it equally from the animals that hunt them. A Tyrannosaurus rex in a late Cretaceous forest could approach prey through the filtering effect of dense vegetation, its enormous body partially screened by the intervening trees, its footsteps absorbed by the thick layer of leaf litter and soft soil, its scent dispersed and confused by the complex chemistry of the forest air. On the open plain, none of these advantages exist. A large bipedal predator standing 4 meters at the hip is visible from several kilometers away on flat terrain under clear sky. Any prey animal with functioning eyesight will have detected the threat long before the predator can get within striking range. Biomechanical analysis of Tyrannosaurus rex skeletal proportions, undertaken by researchers including John Hutchinson at the Royal Veterinary College in London, has produced estimates suggesting that T. rex was not a fast runner by the standards of open terrain pursuit. Its leg bones were proportionally shorter relative to its body mass than those of earlier, lighter tyrannosaur relatives. Its center of mass was positioned far forward, pulled by the enormous weight of its skull, requiring the tail and the powerful hip musculature to act as a constant counterweight simply to maintain balance during locomotion. Walking at a comfortable pace of roughly 5 kilometers per hour was physiologically efficient for this body plan. Moving significantly faster required the kind of explosive muscular effort that is metabolically expensive and difficult to sustain. In a forest environment, this was not a disabling limitation. Ambush predation requires brief explosive acceleration from concealment, not sustained high-speed pursuit. A tyrannosaur that waited motionless behind sufficient cover and then lunged forward for 3 or 4 seconds of maximum effort could take prey that had no time to react. The body plan was optimized for exactly this strategy and had been refined by tens of millions of years of forest predation to serve it well. In the grassland, the strategy fails. The prey can see the predator coming. It begins moving away at the first sign of approach, long before the predator can close the distance needed for a lunge attack. The only options available to a predator in this situation are to be fast enough to overtake the fleeing prey before it reaches safety, which requires sustained high-speed pursuit, or to be clever enough to cut off the prey's escape route before it can be taken, which requires anticipating the prey's movement and coordinating with other predators to control multiple escape angles simultaneously. Both pressures bear on the tyrannosaur lineages of the alternative Miocene simultaneously, and both drive change in the same direction. Bodies become leaner over millions of generations. Natural selection consistently favors individuals with proportionally longer legs, lighter skulls, and a center of mass positioned further back over the hips, because these individuals are incrementally faster and more energetically efficient during locomotion. The changes accumulate slowly, but without reversal, because the environment punishes the alternatives with starvation. By 15 million years ago in the alternative timeline, the dominant large predators of the continental grasslands are recognizably tyrannosaur descendants, but transformed. They stand perhaps 6 meters long rather than 12, weigh 2 tons rather than 9, and move with a balanced, forward-leaning posture that allows them to cover ground at a sustained trot for hours at a time. This capacity for sustained aerobic locomotion, entirely absent from their Cretaceous ancestors, is built on a foundation that non-dinosaurian predators cannot easily replicate. The respiratory system inherited from archosaur ancestors and shared by all dinosaurs and their bird descendants moves air through the lungs in one direction only, extracting oxygen across a continuous exchange surface with each breath. The efficiency of this system during sustained aerobic exercise is substantially higher than that of the bidirectional mammalian lung. Modern birds can sustain flight at altitudes where the available oxygen would incapacitate a mammal of equivalent size. Bar-headed geese cross the Himalayas at altitudes above 8,000 meters, breathing air with roughly one-third the oxygen content available at sea level, and do so without apparent distress. The reason is the unidirectional flow architecture of the avian lung, which extracts a much higher proportion of the available oxygen from each breath than a mammalian lung can achieve under the same conditions. A theropod dinosaur pursuing prey across a grassland for 40 minutes at a sustained trot is running on a respiratory engine that is fundamentally better matched to the demands of aerobic endurance than anything a mammalian predator. Lineage could evolve within the same time frame, but speed and endurance alone do not solve the problem of hunting prey that has already begun moving when the predator is still several hundred meters away. The solution that emerges across multiple tyrannosaur lineages during the alternative Miocene draws on the same principle that African wild dogs have independently discovered in the actual Cenozoic. Pursuit hunting in coordinated groups, where different individuals take on different roles in a spatially distributed attack, is more effective than any individual can achieve alone. And it works at distances and over terrain that would defeat any solo predator. The evidence for cooperative behavior in fossil theropods is genuinely ambiguous. Trackway sites where multiple large theropod footprints appear to be moving in the same direction at the same time have been interpreted as possible evidence of group travel, if not coordinated hunting. Bone accumulations that contain remains of multiple individual tyrannosaurs, along with the remains of large hadrosaurs, have been found at sites including the Dry Island Bone Bed in Alberta, though the interpretation of these sites is contested. In the alternative timeline, the selective pressure for cooperation in the open grassland is far more intense than it was in the Cretaceous forest. The prey is larger relative to any individual predator, more capable of coordinated defense, and visible from great distances. An individual predator attempting to approach a herd of mature ceratopsians across open terrain will find the herd already moving away before it has closed half the distance. A group of predators, approaching from multiple angles simultaneously, can divide the herd's defensive response and create confusion that a lone predator cannot. The communication required to coordinate this kind of spatially distributed attack is substantially more complex than anything forest predation demands. Individuals must signal intentions, acknowledge signals from others, and adjust their positions in response to the behavior of both the prey and their fellow hunters. In wolf packs and African wild dog packs, this communication is carried in vocalizations, postural signals, and direct eye contact. In the theropod predators of the alternative Miocene, visual signaling across the open grassland becomes the primary channel. Feather patches on the face, throat, and forearms, visible at distances of several hundred meters, communicate states of alertness and intention. A specific posture, adopted when a hunt is about to begin, propagates through the group as each individual reads the body language of its neighbors and adjusts accordingly. The coordination that emerges from this communication is not equivalent to conscious strategic planning. It does not require any individual animal to hold a mental model of the entire hunting situation and reason about alternatives. It requires only that each animal respond to a set of social signals with a set of evolved responses, and that those responses, taken together across a group of 6 or 8 individuals, spread over several hundred meters of open terrain, produce an emergent pattern of movement that is tactically effective. This is precisely the mechanism by which wolf packs and wild dog packs coordinate their hunts, and decades of behavioral observation confirm that it works with remarkable consistency without requiring any capacity for deliberate strategy. The grassland predators of the alternative Miocene are not planning their hunts. They are following ancient instructions written into their nervous systems by millions of years of selection. But the pattern those instructions produce, when 10 individuals execute them simultaneously across the open plain, looks from a distance very much like something that has been designed. Among those smaller predators moving through the margins of the great grasslands, hunting rodent-sized mammals and large insects in the grass stems, the troodontids have been accumulating something that the larger tyrannosaur descendants have not needed to develop in the same degree. In the actual fossil record of the late Cretaceous, the troodontids were already distinguished from all other dinosaur lineages by a single measurable characteristic: their encephalization quotient, a ratio comparing actual brain mass to the expected brain mass for a vertebrate of a given body size, was higher than that of any other known non-avian dinosaur. The encephalization quotient for most large dinosaurs falls below 1/10. For Troodon, the best-studied member of this group, estimates place it at roughly 5 to 6 times the average for non-avian dinosaurs as a whole. The encephalization quotient is an imperfect measure of cognitive capacity. It does not account for the internal organization of the brain, which matters as much as overall size for determining what the brain can do. But as a first approximation of where selection has been investing metabolic resources, it is informative. A brain is metabolically expensive tissue. It consumes a disproportionate share of an animal's total energy budget. Natural selection does not expand brains unless the benefits of doing so exceed the costs. That the troodontids were already investing in enlarged brains in the Cretaceous means that the environments they inhabited were already rewarding cognitive capacity with survival and reproduction. In the alternative timeline, 66 million years of additional selection in increasingly complex environments would continue to build on that foundation. The best living analog for what the alternative Miocene troodontids might have become is not the primate, but the corvid. Crows, ravens, rooks, and jackdaws are members of a bird family that evolved from theropod dinosaurs and have retained several features of their theropod heritage, including relatively large brains for their body size, complex social structures, and behavioral flexibility that extends into genuine problem-solving. Their encephalization quotients are comparable to those of great apes, and the specific cognitive capabilities they display have been documented with experimental precision that leaves little room for doubt about their nature. In 2002, a captive crow named Betty at Oxford University was presented with a straight piece of wire and a task that required a hooked tool to complete. She had never encountered wire before. Within minutes, she had bent the wire into a hook and used it to extract food from a vertical tube. She was not imitating a behavior she had previously observed. She was constructing a tool to a functional specification that she apparently held as a mental representation before the tool existed. Subsequent research with New Caledonian crows in the field has confirmed that wild populations manufacture hooked tools from plant material, carry them between foraging sites for reuse, and pass tool-making techniques between individuals through social learning. The cognitive machinery required for this behavior, the ability to represent an absent object, to plan actions toward a future state, and to learn methods rather than only outcomes from observing others, was once considered uniquely human. The corvids demonstrate that it can evolve in a very different body plan, driven by very different ecological pressures, in a lineage that last shared a common ancestor with primates more than 300 million years ago. The troodontids of the alternative Miocene, 50 million years further down the same evolutionary branch, are in a position to develop comparable capabilities through a different route. Their ecological situation on the open grassland is one that specifically rewards the same cognitive traits the corvids have developed. The prey they hunt, small mammals and birds and lizards moving unpredictably through complex terrain, cannot be taken reliably by ambush or by brute force. It requires tracking, anticipating movement, understanding the behavioral tendencies of specific prey species well enough to predict where they will go when disturbed, and coordinating with other individuals to cut off escape routes before they can be used. These demands are fundamentally similar to the demands that drove corvid intelligence, and they bear on the troodontids from every direction simultaneously. The vocalizations of these animals become more complex during this period. Most vertebrates vocalize, but very few can modify their vocalizations based on what they hear from others. This capacity, called vocal learning, has evolved independently in songbirds, parrots, hummingbirds, bats, cetaceans, and humans. Its neural basis in songbirds and parrots involves a set of brain regions that share genetic and developmental similarities with the regions involved in human language. Even though the two lineages evolved vocal learning independently, the troodontids are theropods closely related to the ancestors of all birds, including songbirds and parrots. The developmental pathways that produced vocal learning in multiple bird lineages were present in the ancestral theropod genome as latent possibilities. In the alternative Miocene, where complex communication confers increasingly large survival advantages, those pathways begin to be expressed. A troodontid group on the open grassland in this period uses vocalizations for purposes that go beyond the basic alarm calls and territorial displays common to most vertebrates. Specific call patterns communicate information about prey location and type. Modified call sequences signal the initiation and abandonment of coordinated hunts. Individual recognition calls allow group members to identify each other at distances where visual identification is difficult. The vocabulary of these calls, measured as the number of distinct patterns that produce distinct behavioral responses in other individuals, is substantially larger in the most social troodontid lineages than in their more solitary relatives. The correlation between social complexity and vocal repertoire size is one of the most consistent findings in comparative cognition research, observed in dolphins, primates, corvids, and parrots alike. The troodontids are adding one more data point to that relationship. The question that naturally arises at this point is whether this trajectory leads eventually toward human-like technological intelligence. The honest answer is that it almost certainly does not, and understanding why illuminates something important about the nature of human cognition that is rarely appreciated. Human technological development depends not merely on individual intelligence, but on what cognitive scientist Michael Tomasello has called the cultural ratchet. Each generation of humans builds on the innovations of the previous generation, adding new knowledge to an accumulating store rather than rediscovering everything from scratch. This cumulative culture requires two things that are extraordinarily rare in animal cognition. First, the ability to imitate not just the end result of an innovation, but the method by which it is achieved. Second, the motivation to teach, to actively transmit information to younger individuals rather than simply producing it in front of them and allowing observation. Without both elements, knowledge dies with the individual that created it and cannot accumulate across generations. With both elements, even modest individual intelligence can produce exponential growth in collective knowledge over centuries. The troodontids of the alternative Miocene are likely developing individual problem-solving capacities that rival those of the great apes. Their social transmission of behavioral innovations is probably comparable to what is observed in chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys, where individuals observe and adopt each other's techniques for processing food or accessing resources. But the specific combination of high-fidelity imitation and active pedagogy that enables cumulative culture requires a particular configuration of social motivation and cognitive architecture that has emerged clearly only once in the evolutionary record in the hominin lineage of the actual Cenozoic. The troodontids will not build shelters or shape stone or kindle fire. They will not accumulate knowledge across generations in a way that transforms the material world around them. But they will know their grassland in a way that no other predator does. They will track individual prey animals across distances and time spans that exceed what any instinct could manage. They will remember and communicate and adapt not at the pace of biological evolution, but at the faster pace of learned behavior passed from individual to individual across a lifetime. That is not nothing. In the long history of life on Earth, that places them in very select company. Around 2.5 million years ago, the pattern of glaciation that has been building in the northern hemisphere since the late Pliocene crosses a threshold. Ice sheets that had previously formed only during the most extreme climate episodes now begin to advance on a semi-regular rhythm, covering vast portions of the northern continents with ice several kilometers thick, retreating during interglacial periods of 10 to 20,000 years, and then advancing again. The cycle repeats more than 50 times over the course of the Pleistocene epoch, each repetition reshaping the geography and the ecology of the northern hemisphere in ways that no previous era has demanded. The mechanism driving this rhythm was identified mathematically by the Serbian geophysicist Milutin Milankovic in the 1920s, working from first principles of orbital mechanics decades before the geological evidence to confirm his calculations had been collected. The Earth's orbit around the Sun is not fixed. It changes shape on a cycle of roughly 100,000 years, shifting between more circular and more elliptical configurations. The angle at which Earth's rotational axis tilts relative to the orbital plane varies on a cycle of approximately 41,000 years. And the high end in the direction in which that axis points, the phenomenon known as precession, rotates through a full cycle of roughly 23,000 years. Each of these variations alters the distribution of solar energy across the planet's surface, changing how much heat reaches the high northern latitudes during summer. When summer insolation at high latitudes drops below a critical threshold, the snow that fell during winter does not fully melt. It accumulates, year by year, reflecting increasingly more sunlight back into space and cooling the climate further in a positive feedback that eventually locks the northern continents under sheets of ice. The ice ages are not accidents. They are the mechanical consequence of the planet's orbital geometry, and they are therefore predictable in a way that asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions are not. At glacial maximum, the Laurentide ice sheet covers virtually all of what will one day become Canada and extends deep into the northern regions of the continental interior. In places, the ice is more than 3 kilometers thick. Its weight is sufficient to depress the land surface beneath it by hundreds of meters, compressing the bedrock downward into the mantle with a force that will require tens of thousands of years to recover once the ice melts. Scandinavia and northern Britain are buried under the Fennoscandian ice sheet. Sea levels across the planet fall by as much as 120 meters as the water that normally circulates through the ocean is locked into continental ice. The shallow continental shelves, which today lie beneath tens of meters of ocean water, become exposed land. Asia and North America are connected by a broad land bridge, where the Bering Sea sits in the interglacial world. Britain is connected to continental Europe. Indonesia's islands merge into a single landmass. The world is a different shape when the ice advances. And for the dinosaurs of the alternative Pleistocene, that different shape presents challenges unlike anything their lineage has faced in nearly 200 million years. The initial advance of the ice sheets drives the larger dinosaur populations southward in waves. The ceratopsian herds that had been grazing the high-latitude grasslands during the warmer Pliocene find their summer feeding grounds shrinking beneath the advancing ice front. They follow the retreating edge of productive vegetation, pushing into the continental interiors at lower latitudes, where other populations already exist. The jostling of populations at these latitudes drives competition, divergence, and rapid local adaptation as different lineages interact in novel combinations. The ecological pressure is intense, and natural selection responds to intense pressure with accelerated change. The populations that do not retreat, or cannot retreat fast enough, face conditions that would have been lethal to any Cretaceous dinosaur. The average temperatures at the ice margin during a glacial maximum drop to -20 degrees Celsius or colder during the long winter months. Snow covers the ground for 8 or 9 months of the year. Vegetation, already sparse in the cold season, is buried under a thick layer of ice and frozen powder that prevents access to the roots and stems that would otherwise be available. An animal that cannot find food for months at a time must either store enough energy before winter to survive it, migrate to where food is available, or employ some combination of both. The Bergman effect, which has been driving size increases in the colder climate populations since the Oligocene, now reaches its most extreme expression. In the actual Pleistocene, woolly mammoths were larger than their tropical elephant relatives. Cave bears exceeded modern brown bears in body mass, and the Irish elk carried antlers spanning 3.5 meters on a body scaled to carry them. Cold selects for size because the ratio of body surface area to volume decreases as body size increases, reducing heat loss relative to the volume of warm tissue producing that heat. The largest individuals in any cold-adapted dinosaur population lose heat more slowly, can sustain their body temperature on less food per unit time, and can maintain larger fat reserves that extend survival through the lean winter months. The ceratopsian descendants, living at the margins of the ice in the alternative Pleistocene, are the largest members of their lineage in 200 million years of evolution. A full-grown adult of the predominant high-latitude species measures 10 meters from beak to tail and stands nearly 3 meters at the shoulder. Its body is barrel-shaped, packed with the fat reserves and fermentation chambers needed to process enormous quantities of tough, frozen, or nutrient-poor vegetation during the brief Arctic summer and survive the winter on stored energy. Its frill has become thick and functional rather than ornate, and across the entirety of its body, from the dome of its wide skull to the base of its heavy tail, it carries a dense coat of filamentous integument, not the bright display plumage of its Miocene ancestors, but the muted, heavily insulating underlayer of an animal built for cold. Seen from a distance across a snow-covered landscape, this creature would be easy to mistake for a feature of the terrain, a low, dark mass moving steadily against the white. What drives the populations of the glacial margins most profoundly, beyond temperature and food scarcity, is the light. The high-latitude zones where the most productive summer grazing occurs are also the zones where winter brings months of near-total darkness. Above 60 degrees of latitude, the sun does not rise above the horizon for weeks at a time during the midwinter period. The behavioral adaptations required to maintain feeding, social cohesion, and predator detection in conditions of extended darkness represent a set of demands that the Cretaceous polar dinosaur populations were already beginning to meet, as evidenced by the year-round presence of diverse dinosaur species in the Prince Creek Formation of northern Alaska during the late Cretaceous. In the alternative Pleistocene, those adaptations have been developing for millions of additional years. The large eyes of the theropod lineages, refined over the warm Eocene and Miocene, serve them particularly well in the dim light of the polar autumn. The feathers that cover the limbs and face of these animals, having evolved primarily for insulation, serve a secondary function in muffling the sounds of movement through snow, reducing the acoustic signature of a predator approaching prey, or prey fleeing from a predator across a frozen landscape. The winter world operates on different sensory frequencies from the summer world, and the animals that inhabit it have been learning those frequencies for a long time. The ice advances and retreats 50 times and more over the course of the alternative Pleistocene. Each advance tests the populations it touches. Each retreat allows survivors to expand from refugia in the lower latitudes, carrying with them the adaptations that have been selected and refined by the cold. The glacial cycles function as an evolutionary pressure pump, compressing and expanding populations, separating lineages during glacial maxima, and allowing them to come back into contact during interglacials, driving both divergence and hybridization at a pace that accelerates the production of new forms. The dinosaurs emerging from this crucible are not the dinosaurs that entered it. They are tougher, more variable, more capable of tolerating conditions that would have been lethal to any ancestor. The ice does not defeat them. It refines them. While the dinosaurs are negotiating the ice ages on land, the oceans have been following their own parallel trajectory through the same 66 million years. And in the ocean, the alternative timeline has produced a world that diverges from the actual Cenozoic Sea even more starkly than the land does. Because in the actual timeline, the KPG extinction did not spare the water. It struck the marine world with equal force, collapsing the phytoplankton communities that form the base of every ocean food chain and cascading upward through every level of the marine food web. The Mosasaurs, those large, fast-swimming lizard relatives that had become the dominant large predators of the late Cretaceous ocean, were gone within the same geological instant as the non-avian dinosaurs on land. The Plesiosaurs, an older lineage that had occupied the ocean since the Triassic period, went with them. In the alternative timeline, neither of these endings occurs. The ocean remains theirs. By the latest Cretaceous, the Mosasaurs had diversified into at least 40 distinct genera, representing a range of body plans and feeding strategies that covered ecological space from the surface waters to considerable depth. The smallest were around 1 meter in length, nimble pursuit predators of fish in shallow coastal waters. The largest, Mosasaurus hoffmanii, reached lengths of 14 to 17 meters and possessed a skull designed to generate enormous bite force through deeply rooted, conical teeth that could puncture the shells of ammonites and the carapaces of large sea turtles. Between these extremes, different lineages had evolved, teeth flattened into crushing platforms for processing hard-shelled prey, teeth reduced to small knobs suggesting possible mollusk feeding, and in at least one lineage, hints of morphology that some researchers have cautiously interpreted as consistent with a degree of filter feeding. The radiation had been underway for only about 20 million years. Given another 66 million, its scope is difficult to overstate. A detail preserved in exceptional fossil specimens illuminates the biology of these animals in a way that anatomical study alone cannot. Preserved soft tissue from several mosasaur specimens, examined using spectroscopic analysis of pigment-bearing molecules, reveals that the dorsal surface of at least some species was pigmented with eumelanin, producing a dark coloration, while the ventral surface was significantly lighter. This countershading pattern, identical to that found in modern sharks, dolphins, penguins, and many pelagic fish, is an adaptation to open water predation that functions by making the animal less visible from both above and below. When seen from above against the dark depths, the dark dorsal surface blends into the background. When seen from below against the bright surface light, the pale ventral surface is less conspicuous. The convergence of this same coloration pattern in lineages as distantly related as mosasaurs, sharks, and cetaceans is one of the clearest demonstrations in comparative biology that certain solutions are so well matched to certain problems that natural selection arrives at them repeatedly, independently across hundreds of millions of years of divergent evolution. The Mosasaurs had an additional sensory tool that most marine predators lack. Their close relationship to varanid lizards, the group that includes the modern Komodo dragon, means they inherited the chemoreceptive tongue of that lineage. Modern varanids use a deeply forked tongue to collect chemical particles from the air and transfer them to the Jacobson's organ in the roof of the mouth, where the chemical information is processed in a manner analogous to smell, but operating at far greater sensitivity and with directional precision that nostrils cannot match. Mosasaur skull anatomy shows evidence of the same system. In open water, where chemical gradients disperse slowly from bleeding prey or spawning fish schools, a mosasaur moving through the water and periodically extruding its forked tongue is sampling a three-dimensional chemical landscape invisible to any purely visual predator. The plesiosaurs represent a second and very different body plan, occupying the same ocean. The long-necked plesiosaurs, of which Elasmosaurus is the most famous example, possessed necks containing up to 72 vertebrae, more than any other known vertebrate, giving them a neck that was longer than the rest of the body combined. This anatomy generated significant scientific debate, beginning with the dramatic mistake made by Edward Drinker Cope in 1868 when he reconstructed the first known specimen of Elasmosaurus with its head on what proved to be the tail end, a reversal discovered by his rival Othniel Charles Marsh, and one that caused Cope considerable embarrassment. The functional interpretation of the long neck has been contested for the century and a half since. The neck of Elasmosaurus could not have been whipped forward rapidly like a striking snake. Its vertebrae locked the neck into a relatively limited range of vertical movement. The current understanding is that the long neck functioned more like a slow, precise fishing tool, allowing the small head to be positioned within a school of fish with minimal water displacement that would otherwise warn the prey of the predator's approach, a mechanism of stealth operating not through speed, but through the gentle parting of water by a narrow structure far ahead of the main body mass. In the alternative timeline, both the Mosasaur and Plesiosaur lineages are subject to the same suite of environmental changes that drove terrestrial evolution. The cooling of the Oligocene and Miocene, driven by the Drake Passage opening and Himalayan weathering, changes ocean circulation patterns and productivities. The deep cold waters of the Antarctic bottom current, circulating northward along the ocean floor, produce upwelling zones where nutrient-rich deep water rises to the surface and generates extraordinary concentrations of plankton, krill, and small fish. These productive upwelling zones represent one of the richest available food resources in the ocean, but exploiting them requires physiological capacities that the shallow-water Cretaceous mosasaurs did not possess. The pressure of selection on mosasaur lineages in the alternative Cenozoic pushes several of them toward deeper, colder water. Large body size, which has been increasing in some lineages since the Oligocene through the same Bergman principle operating on land, provides the first tool, an animal large enough to maintain elevated body temperature through gigantothermy. The passive thermal inertia of a very large body can tolerate water temperatures that would physiologically disable a smaller ectotherm. Leatherback sea turtles in the actual world already demonstrate this principle, maintaining body temperatures up to 18 degrees above the surrounding water through the combined effect of large body mass, counter-current heat exchange in their flippers, and metabolic heat from sustained swimming. A mosasaur 3 times the mass of a leatherback would hold its thermal advantage proportionally longer. In the alternative Pleistocene Ocean, the largest mosasaur lineages have pushed far beyond the coastal and epipelagic zones of their Cretaceous ancestors. They move through the open ocean at latitudes where the water temperature is near freezing, sustained by the enormous productivity of the upwelling zones and by physiological adaptations that no living reptile has achieved. Their body plans have converged across 66 million years of independent evolution toward the streamlined torpedo shape that fluid dynamics imposes on all fast, large-bodied swimmers. The long limbs of the Cretaceous mosasaur have reduced to narrow, rigid hydrofoil flippers. The undulating swimming motion of the body has been progressively replaced by the tail-driven thrust of a broad fluke, a convergence with the locomotion of both sharks and cetaceans that has been driven by exactly the same hydrodynamic selection pressure. The ocean of the alternative Pleistocene is not without its other predators. Sharks, whose lineage is ancient enough to have survived every mass extinction event in the history of complex animal life, persist throughout the Cenozoic alongside the Mosasaurs. The Odontodontidae, the shark family that in the actual Cenozoic produced the enormous filter feeder Otodus megalodon, are present in the alternative ocean and have been evolving in competition with and under predation pressure from the largest Mosasaurs for 66 million years. The ecological relationship between these two ancient lineages has shaped both of them. The sharks have been pushed toward niches that the Mosasaurs exploit less efficiently. Some have become faster and more maneuverable in open water, filling a niche the slow-cruising giant Mosasaurs cannot occupy. Others have diversified into the deep ocean, where the complete darkness and extreme pressure create conditions that large-bodied reptilian endothermy cannot easily penetrate. The mammals that transition to aquatic life in the Eocene, the ancestors of the actual Cenozoic whales, are present in the alternative ocean, but occupy a secondary position that their counterparts never achieved in the actual timeline. The shallow coastal waters and river mouths they exploit are already occupied by smaller mosasaur lineages that have held those niches for 50 million years before the first Archaeocete entered the water. They are not absent from the ocean, but they are not its masters. They occupy the margins. The masters are old, and in 66 million years, they have had more than enough time to make the ocean entirely their own. The current interglacial began approximately 12,000 years ago. The ice has retreated northward, and the great continental grasslands are at their warmest and most productive state in nearly 100,000 years. The atmosphere contains roughly 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide. The continents occupy positions almost identical to the ones they hold in the world that actually exists. The physics and chemistry of this planet are indistinguishable from those of Earth in the actual timeline. What is different, profoundly and irreversibly, is everything living on it. Standing in the interior of a temperate grassland on the alternative present continent of North America, the first thing to notice is the sound. It is not the sound of a modern prairie, which is largely a landscape of wind through grass and the calls of birds. It is denser, more layered, and it carries a different kind of weight. From somewhere to the north, at a distance measured in kilometers rather than meters, there is a low, continuous resonance that moves through the ground before it reaches the ears. It is the collective footfall of a large herd of ceratopsian descendants, animals that now stand 2.5 meters at the shoulder and travel in coordinated groups of several hundred, moving along established migration routes that have been traveled by their lineage for so long that the paths themselves are worn into the landscape as shallow depressions in the soil, visible from above, running for hundreds of kilometers between seasonal grazing grounds. These animals are recognizably ceratopsians. A comparative anatomist transported to this world from the actual Cenozoic would identify the beaked skull, the frill structure, the quadrupedal posture, and the general organization of the skeleton immediately. But 66 million years have transformed every detail of the animal that carries that skeleton. The beak is broader and more precisely squared, the dental replacement mechanism running continuously behind it to maintain a grinding surface of remarkable efficiency. The frill, once an elaborate advertisement structure, has been reduced to a functional ridge of thickened bone above the neck, retaining its vascular channels and serving primarily as a thermoregulatory surface in the warm summer grassland. The body is covered in a mosaic of scales and filaments, the filamentous regions concentrated on the neck and flanks, providing a degree of insulation suited to the seasonal variability that the Pleistocene has imposed as a persistent feature of temperate climates. From a distance of several hundred meters, a herd of these animals moving across open ground produces a visual effect not unlike the movement of a large herd of bison or wildebeest, but the individual animals are larger, their profiles lower and wider, their movement marked by the slow sweep of their broad beaks close to the ground as they crop in long, continuous arcs. Watching from a low ridge overlooking the grassland, something else is visible at the herd's perimeter. Three animals moving in a wide, unhurried arc across the downwind flank of the herd. They are bipedal, approximately 2 meters tall, covered in dense feathering that grades from a dark brownish gray on the back to a lighter tone on the chest and throat. Their gait is a continuous, ground-covering trot that makes no apparent effort to close the distance to the herd. They are simply moving in parallel with it, maintaining position at the edge of visual detection range for the herd's perimeter animals. This is the beginning of a hunt that may not conclude for several hours. The tyrannosaur descendants of the alternative present have perfected the mathematics of attrition. They are not chasing, they are following, watching, reading the herd for the individual that moves slightly less fluidly than the others, the animal that turns its head to scan less frequently, the one whose posture reveals exhaustion or injury at a level that would be invisible to any observer less practiced than these. 6 million years of open-terrain pursuit hunting have produced an animal whose cognitive engagement with prey behavior borders on the clinical. These predators recognize individual members of the herds they follow. They have observed specific individuals across multiple encounters, spanning days or weeks. The information they carry about specific prey animals is not instinct. It is memory, maintained through a neural architecture that has been expanding under selection pressure for as long as the grasslands have been their hunting ground. The forest at the grassland's margin holds a different world. Here, in the deep shade of the temperate canopy, the arboreal Maniraptoran lineages that began their vertical ascent 40 million years ago in the Eocene forest are now fully committed to a life that rarely or never touches the ground. Some are small, no larger than a modern crow, moving through the outer branches of the canopy with a dexterity that no bird achieves, gripping and releasing and reorienting with 4 independently movable limbs, each foot capable of gripping a branch securely while the hands reach for the next hold. The largest arboreal forms are the size of a large monkey, and they move through the canopy's interior branches with a slower, more deliberate care, their heavier bodies requiring thicker branches and more careful root selection. What these larger arboreal animals are doing when they are not moving or feeding is harder to characterize precisely, but it occupies a substantial portion of their day. They sit near each other in small groups. They produce vocalizations of varying length and structure. They watch each other produce these vocalizations and respond to them in ways that suggest shared reference to specific objects or conditions in the environment. Whether the communication system these animals use constitutes language in any meaningful sense of the term is a question that would require decades of careful behavioral research to answer. What is already visible without such research is that these animals are doing something with each other that goes well beyond the social communication observed in any non-avian reptile and rivals the complexity of what is observed in the most cognitively sophisticated birds and mammals of the Actualthenozoic. The mammals are present everywhere in this world. They are diverse, numerous, and ecologically successful by any absolute measure. The rodents and insectivores form the dense, fast-reproducing underclass of virtually every terrestrial ecosystem, just as they do in the actual world. Bats fill the aerial insectivore niche at night, as they do today. The herbivorous mammals, the artiodactyls and perissodactyls, whose radiation was so dramatic in the actual Cenozoic, are present in the alternative world, but occupy narrower ecological space. They fill the niches that the dinosaur lineages have not claimed or have not yet fully filled. The small to medium body size herbivore niches in forested and transitional habitats. Deer-sized mammals browse in the understory beneath the ceratopsian-dominated open grasslands. Medium-sized predatory mammals occupy the nocturnal predator niche in forest environments where the larger theropods operate primarily by day. These are successful, diverse, ecologically important animals, but they are not the dominant forms. They never had the opportunity to become so. What the alternative present world possesses that the actual world does not is completeness. The actual world, even before the depredations of recent centuries, was already living with the ghost of a Pleistocene fauna that had been progressively thinned across the preceding 50,000 years. The giant herbivores of every continent, animals shaped by millions of years of predation pressure from large carnivores, had been removed from most ecosystems, leaving food webs that function, but that carry the structural strain of missing nodes. The alternative present has suffered no such loss. Every trophic level is occupied by the animals that evolved to occupy it. The predators are large enough to take the largest prey. The prey populations are large enough to sustain the predators. The grasses are grazed at the intensity that their growth architecture was shaped to tolerate. The seed dispersers move through the forests, carrying the trees to where the trees need to be. The upwelling zones of the ocean are harvested by animals large enough to reach them. The entire system runs at a level of ecological completeness that no landscape in the actual world has experienced for tens of thousands of years. The world of the alternative present is not a paradise in any simple sense. It is violent, abundant, and indifferent, as all wild systems are. Its predators take the weak and the old, and occasionally the young. Its herbivores strip entire sections of vegetation before moving on. Its storms and droughts reshape entire ecosystems over decades. But it is whole, and wholeness in a biosphere is something that can only be built across time, measured not in centuries, but in millions of years. It has had all the time it needed. The result is a world that has never existed except in this telling. But its logic is sound. Its biology is continuous with everything the fossil record reveals about the actual past, and its animals are as real as anything that has ever lived, in the only sense that matters. They are what the physics and chemistry and biology of this planet would have built, given a slightly different Tuesday morning 66 million years ago. There is a thought experiment that the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould introduced in his 1989 book about the Cambrian fauna of the Burgess Shale. He called it replaying the tape. The idea is this: if it were possible to return to any point in the history of life and restart the process from that point, allowing every subsequent event to unfold freely, would the result resemble what actually happened? Would the same lineages diversify? Would the same ecological roles be filled by the same types of animals? Would intelligence emerge from the same lineage, or from a different one, or not at all? Gould's answer, which he defended with characteristic force, was that the tape would produce radically different results each time. That the history of life is dominated not by law-like inevitability, but by contingency, by events that could easily have gone otherwise, and that the difference between a world with intelligence and a world without it might rest on something as arbitrary as the position of a rock in space on a specific morning 66 million years ago. The alternative world explored in this account does not fully confirm Gould's position, nor does it contradict it. It offers something more nuanced and perhaps more interesting than either conclusion alone. The contingency is real. The specific animals that occupy the major ecological roles in the alternative present are not the ones that occupy those roles in the actual world. The large grazing herbivores of the alternative grasslands are ceratopsians, not bovids. The pack hunters of the open plain are tyrannosaur descendants, not canids. The large soarers ruling the thermals are darkid pterosaur descendants, not eagles. The dominant large predators of the ocean are mosasaurs, not killer whales. These are genuinely different animals with genuinely different biologies, and the world they have built together is genuinely different from the one that actually exists. Gould's contingency is visible in every one of these differences. But something else is also visible. The ecological roles themselves are not contingent. They are determined by physics and ecology with a precision that leaves very little room for chance. An open grassland will always be grazed by large herbivores that travel in herds, because the grassland creates the conditions that make herd behavior adaptive, and herd behavior creates the conditions that allow large herbivores to persist. Open grasslands will always be hunted by pursuit predators that operate in groups, because the absence of cover makes ambush ineffective, and the mobility and defensive coordination of large herbivore herds makes group pursuit more effective than solo hunting. Oceanic ecosystems will always be dominated by streamlined, fast-swimming large predators, because the physics of water movement constrain the shapes of fast swimmers to a narrow range of possibilities. Large social animals living in complex environments will always evolve larger brains relative to body size than their non-social relatives, because social complexity is cognitively demanding in ways that have the same consequences regardless of which lineage experiences them. This is what evolutionary biologists call convergence, the independent evolution of similar forms in unrelated lineages facing similar selective pressures. It is not a curiosity or an exception to the rule of evolution. It is one of its most consistent and reproducible phenomena. The ichthyosaurs of the Mesozoic, the dolphins of the Cenozoic, and the sharks of the last 400 million years all arrived at the same torpedo-shaped, fast-moving, top predator body plan through completely independent evolutionary pathways, driven by the same physical constraints of moving efficiently through water. The wings of pterosaurs, birds, and bats evolved independently 3 times from non-flying ancestors, and in each case produced a structure that uses the same aerodynamic principles because aerodynamics does not negotiate. The convergent evolution observed between the alternative world and the actual world, the ceratopsian that looks ecologically like a bison, the tyrannosaur descendant that behaves like an African wild dog, the mosasaur that swims like a dolphin, is not coincidence. It is the signature of physical law operating on biological material. What the alternative world reveals about contingency, therefore, is that it operates at one level, but not at another. The question of which lineage occupies a given ecological role is contingent on historical events. The question of what kind of animal eventually fills that role is substantially determined by physics, chemistry, and the structure of ecosystems. Gould was right that replaying the tape produces different animals. The physical laws that govern what those animals must be like, in order to function in their environments, produce a world that is recognizably organized along the same principles as the actual one. There is one domain, however, where the alternative world and the actual world diverge in a way that is not explained by convergence alone. In the actual world, 66 million years of mammalian evolution produced. Among the extraordinarily diverse outcomes of that process, one lineage capable of accumulating knowledge across generations, transforming the physical world through technology, and constructing detailed scientific accounts of how the alternative world might have looked. In the alternative world, 66 million years of continued dinosaur evolution produced nothing comparable. The troodontid lineages approached the cognitive level of the great apes. The arboreal maniraptorans developed communication systems of considerable complexity. But no lineage crossed the threshold into cumulative culture, the self-amplifying accumulation of knowledge across generations that makes technological civilization possible. This asymmetry is worth sitting with for a moment. The same length of time, the same planet, the same physical laws, very different cognitive outcomes. The actual world, in which the mammals inherited the emptied ecological space left by the extinction, produced technological intelligence within 66 million years. The alternative world, in which the most cognitively sophisticated large-bodied tetrapods continued to evolve without interruption through those same 66 million years, did not. The lineages of the alternative world are not unintelligent. They are, by most measures, more cognitively sophisticated than the non-human mammals of the actual world, but they did not reach the specific threshold that the hominin lineage crossed in the actual Cenozoic. The empty niche concept provides one part of the explanation. The KPG extinction did not merely remove the dinosaurs, it removed the ecological constraints that had been limiting mammalian body size, diet, and habitat range for 100 million years. The small, largely nocturnal, insectivorous and seed-eating mammals of the late Cretaceous were not constrained by intelligence or potential, but by ecological competition. The ecological space they needed in order to diversify into the forms that eventually produced primates was occupied. When the extinction cleared that space, the diversification proceeded with extraordinary speed, and the result, 66 million years later, was a lineage building instruments to examine rocks on other planets. The actual world exists because the asteroid arrived at the right moment on the right trajectory and struck the right geology on the right planet. The alternative world exists because all of those things were very slightly different. Between these two worlds, separated by 30 minutes of orbital geometry, lies everything that distinguishes the world that was built from the world that could have been. Both are made of the same matter, operating under the same laws, inhabiting the same solar system. The difference between them is history, and history, at the scale of 66 million years, can produce differences that matter enormously. The mammals of the alternative world are not absent from this story. They have been present throughout it, moving quietly through the margins of every ecosystem described, surviving every environmental challenge that the planet has imposed on the alternative Cenozoic, and diversifying in their own right into forms that occupy the niches available to them. Understanding what they became in the alternative world and why requires understanding something about what they were in the late Cretaceous and what that origin has meant for every mammal that has lived since. For the entire duration of the Mesozoic era, the mammals occupied a specific and constrained ecological position. They were small. The largest Cretaceous mammals were approximately the size of a modern opossum, and most were considerably smaller, rarely exceeding the mass of a rat or a mouse. They were predominantly nocturnal. They lived in burrows, leaf litter, and the lower forest understory. They ate insects, seeds, and small vertebrates, and they possessed, in consequence of this lifestyle, a suite of sensory and physiological adaptations that distinguished them fundamentally from the dinosaurs that dominated every other ecological tier above them. The evidence for this prolonged nocturnal existence is written into the biology of every living mammal. Research published in the journal Science in 2021, drawing on phylogenetic analysis of the opsin genes that code for color-sensitive cells in the eye, confirmed that the common ancestor of all placental mammals was nocturnal. The transition to active daytime behavior that many mammalian lineages subsequently made, in the actual Cenozoic, from primates to many rodents to the cats and dogs and horses that are so familiar today, all happened after the KPG extinction opened the ecological space that made daytime activity safe and productive for a mammal-sized animal. Before the extinction, moving through the world during daylight hours meant competing directly with dinosaurs that were better suited to those conditions in almost every relevant respect. The mammals stayed in the dark, and the dark shaped them thoroughly. The specific adaptations that nocturnal life produced in the mammalian lineage are not incidental features. They are the foundation of the mammalian sensory world, and some of them eventually became the basis of human cognitive capacity. The mammalian ear, which evolved from bones that in earlier synapsid ancestors formed part of the jaw joint, is capable of detecting sound frequencies and intensities that no reptile ear can match. The mammalian nose contains a quantity of olfactory receptor genes that vastly exceeds what any other vertebrate lineage possesses, allowing the discrimination of thousands of distinct molecular compounds in concentrations of parts per billion. The mammalian brain's neocortex, the sheet of folded neural tissue that eventually produces the cognitive capacities associated with mammalian intelligence, began its expansion as a structure for integrating complex olfactory and auditory information in a dark, three-dimensional environment where smell and hearing provided the primary guide to navigation and prey detection. The large brain that eventually produced human consciousness began as a nocturnal smell processing machine, shaped by the ecological pressure of surviving at the edge of a world ruled by dinosaurs. In the alternative world, this nocturnal pressure does not relent. It continues for an additional 66 million years. The mammals of the alternative Cenozoic remain predominantly small and predominantly nocturnal, occupying the ecological space that the dinosaur lineages have not fully claimed. They are not stagnant, they diversify significantly, filling the nocturnal predator niche at every body size up to about the mass of a large domestic cat, exploiting the forest understory and the soil ecosystem with increasing sophistication, and producing a range of specialized sensory systems that, in the actual world, evolved only in a few exceptional lineages. Echolocation, the biological sonar system independently evolved by bats and by several lineages of toothed whales, requires a specific neural architecture for producing, transmitting, and processing high-frequency sound reflections at the speed needed to navigate around obstacles and locate prey in real time. In the actual Cenozoic, bats developed this system around 52 million years ago and have been refining it ever since, producing approximately 1,400 species that represent roughly 1/5 of all living mammal species. In the alternative world, the selective pressure for sophisticated acoustic navigation among nocturnal mammals is, if anything, stronger than in the actual Cenozoic, because the nocturnal mammals of the alternative world face more intense competition from other nocturnal specialists and cannot expand into diurnal niches. Multiple mammalian lineages, not only bats, develop varying degrees of acoustic sensitivity and short-range echolocation by the alternative present. The primate lineage is present in the alternative world. The earliest known primate, Purgatorius, appeared in the fossil record approximately 65 million years ago in North America, at the very boundary of the Cretaceous and the earliest alternative Paleocene. It was a small, insectivorous and frugivorous animal of the forest understory, not very different in its basic habits from a modern tree shrew. In the actual Cenozoic, the clearance of large body-size niches by the KPG extinction allowed the primate lineage to expand over the following tens of millions of years into larger bodies, more complex social structures, increasingly diverse diets, and eventually into the great apes and the hominids. The ecological space for this expansion was available because the mammals inherited it from the extinct dinosaurs. In the alternative world, that space is not available. The arboreal maniraptoran theropods occupy the canopy. The small to medium body size frugivore and insectivore niches in the forest are intensely competed for by both the diverse bird fauna and the expanding arboreal theropod lineages. The primate lineage, confined to whatever gaps exist in this occupied space, remains small. Its social structures remain complex because complexity is always rewarded by intelligence in a social species, and social intelligence is a mammalian specialty. Its vocalizations remain sophisticated. Its manual dexterity, already remarkable in its small primate ancestors, continues to be refined. But the large body size that is prerequisite for the large absolute brain size that supports cumulative culture never develops, because the ecological conditions that would allow a small primate to grow large are systematically prevented by the prior occupation of every relevant niche. In the deepest part of the alternative world's tropical forest, in a zone between the large arboreal maniraptorans above and the dense nocturnal mammal community at ground level, there are small, large-eyed, nocturnal primates that are among the most cognitively sophisticated animals of their body size in the world. They know their forest in extraordinary detail. They maintain complex social relationships across groups of 15 to 20 individuals. They solve problems that require multiple steps of reasoning and use simple tools, sticks and stones and folded leaves, to access food sources that their hands alone could not reach. They are, in every measurable way, as intelligent as their ecological situation has selected them to be, which is very intelligent indeed for an animal of their size. But they are the size of a large squirrel. They weigh approximately 300 grams. And no matter how intelligent a 300-gram animal becomes, the absolute number of neurons its skull can contain is bounded by the mass of brain tissue its body can sustain metabolically. Intelligence scales with absolute brain size as much as with relative brain size. A 300-gram primate with the highest possible relative brain size is still operating with less total computational capacity than a chimpanzee, and far less than a human. The ecological barrier that constrains the alternative world's primates to small body size is, simultaneously, a ceiling on the cognitive complexity they can achieve regardless of how many additional millions of years evolution is given to work with. They will not become something else. In the alternative world, the path that in the actual Cenozoic led from a small nocturnal insectivore to a species capable of studying its own evolutionary history does not exist. The first step of that path, the expansion from a small constrained body size into the full range of mammalian ecological opportunity, required the ecological emptiness created by the extinction. Without the extinction, the starting conditions for that journey were never established. The primates of the alternative world are not failures. They are exactly what 66 million years of selection in a constrained ecological position produces. They are a version of what we almost were, a version of what we would have remained if the asteroid had arrived on a different morning. Somewhere in the actual world, in a road cut in Spain, or a cliff face in Denmark, or a section of rock exposed along a river in New Zealand, there is a layer of sediment approximately 1 centimeter thick. It is dark, slightly reddish in some locations, rich in a metal called iridium that is vanishingly rare in the crust of the Earth, but abundant in the bodies of stony meteorites. This layer exists in rocks on every continent. It is continuous around the planet at a depth corresponding precisely to 66 million years ago. It is the physical record of an event that lasted less than a second at the moment of impact, and perhaps a year in its full atmospheric consequence, compressed by geology into a stripe of dusty sediment thinner than a fingernail. The layer was identified in 1980 by the physicist Luis Alvarez and his son, the geologist Walter Alvarez, who were studying a section of limestone near Gubbio, in central Italy. They noticed that the boundary between limestone containing Cretaceous fossils and limestone containing no such fossils was marked by this thin, dark band. They measured its iridium content and found it elevated by a factor of 30 times above background. The explanation they proposed, that the iridium had been distributed globally by the vaporization of a large extraterrestrial impactor, was initially controversial and is now the consensus scientific understanding of the KPG boundary. The layer is real. It can be touched. It is in the rock, waiting to be found by anyone who knows where to look. Below the iridium layer, the fossils are Cretaceous, ammonites, non-avian dinosaur bones, the shells of planktonic organisms that no longer exist. Above the iridium layer, these things are absent. The world changed, comprehensively and permanently. In the depth of a centimeter, everything described in the preceding hours of this account lies below that line. In the geological sense, the world of the alternative timeline is the world below the iridium. The actual world is everything above it. Both worlds were possible. Both were consistent with everything physics and chemistry required. Only one of them was built. The other exists only in the implications of what did not happen, which is to say, it exists in the same realm as all the other unrealized possibilities that thread through every moment of physical history, the paths not taken, the structures not assembled, the creatures not born. This is not a lesser kind of existence. Mathematics does not become less real because no one has drawn the triangle. The alternative world does not become less logical because no animal in it ever drew anything at all. The night that covers this account is long. It is the same night that has covered every animal on this planet since the first nervous system learned to distinguish light from darkness. In the alternative world, that night is inhabited by the mammals, moving quietly through undergrowth that is shaped by 66 million years of dinosaur grazing and rooting. The small primates in the tropical forest are awake in this hour, their large eyes catching the thin light that filters through the canopy, their hands finding the branches they have memorized. They are very still for a moment, listening. There is no threat nearby. The forest is making its ordinary sounds. The small primate settles back into its chosen fork of branches and does what small, warm-blooded social animals do when the threat has passed and the body's needs have been briefly met. It rests. The ceratopsian herd on the grassland is also resting, most of them lying on their sides in the cool of the night, the innermost animals pressed together for warmth, the perimeter animals still upright and scanning. They are calm. Their breathing is slow, audible at close range as a deep, rhythmic movement of enormous rib cages. Their eyes reflect very little light. The grassland is quiet, except for the wind moving through the grass stems with a sound that has no word in any language that will never be spoken on this planet. The ocean surface, far from any land, rises and falls in the long swells generated by a storm system 1,000 kilometers to the south. The largest Mosasaur descendant is somewhere below the surface, in the darkness, moving at a slow, fuel-conserving speed through water that is 6 degrees Celsius and completely without light. Its metabolism is running low and steady. It has not needed to hunt for 2 days and will not need to for another 3. It moves through the dark water as it has moved through the dark water for every moment of its life, since it left the warmth of the shallows where it was born, and it will continue to move through the dark water until it does not. This, too, is ordinary. This, too, is the world proceeding according to its nature. In the actual world, above the iridium layer, the night is quieter in one sense and fuller in another. The large animals that once shaped the soundscape of every inhabited landscape are fewer than they were. Most of the megafauna reduced or abet by processes that occurred recently in geological terms. What remains is still vast, still intricate, still governed by the same physics and chemistry and biology that governed everything described in this account. The difference is one of density and completeness, not of kind. The listener who has followed this account from its beginning to this moment has traveled a considerable distance, not in space, which has not changed, and not in the actual timeline, which also has not changed, but in the space of what was possible, which is always larger than what occurred. The journey through the alternative world is a journey through the physics of what this planet would have built under slightly different initial conditions. Every detail of that world is derivable from what is actually known about biology, geology, and atmospheric chemistry. None of it required anything beyond the implications of what would have happened if one very large piece of rock had arrived 30 minutes later on a specific spring morning 66 million years ago. The iridium layer is still in the rock. The fossils above and below it are still where they were deposited. The alternative world exists in the logical space between what those fossils imply and the world that came after the line. Both worlds are held in the same sediment, separated by less than the width of a finger. The rock does not distinguish between them. It simply records what happened, layer by layer, in the slow and patient way that rock has always recorded time. And time, as always, continues.